Imagine an entire army finding itself trapped. Over 250,000 soldiers in a merciless place. They weren't just facing their enemy. They were facing an inferno of ice and frost, with temperatures plunging to 40 degrees below zero. This isn't a scene from a movie. It's the bitter reality the German 6th Army lived through in the winter of 1942. They were just one step away from achieving Hitler's grandest dream. But they didn't realize that victory was actually a trap, and the promised salvation was a death sentence. How did this battle turn into the greatest catastrophe in German military history? The secret lies in one false promise from the highest head of command. On November 16th, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army, was completely confident in his force's advance. He was on the verge of taking the city that bore the name of the man Hitler feared, Stalin. But at the same moment, the great man who would change the course of the war, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, was planning a secret operation that no one had anticipated. The streets of Stalingrad had become a graveyard. Every house, every factory was a bloody battlefield. General Vasily Chukov and his troops in the 62nd Army transformed from city defenders into deadly monsters. But the German army couldn't comprehend that the street fighting was meant for one thing only: to slow their advance. At the same time, thousands of Soviet soldiers were silently advancing in a tight encirclement operation. Suddenly, the tables turned. The hunters became the hunted. The German soldiers were surprised to find themselves completely surrounded in an area no larger than 40 kilometers. This was the moment the countdown began for a tragedy unlike any other in history. The true tragedy would begin at this very moment. When Field Marshal Paulus and the commanders of the 6th Army realized the full extent of the encirclement, their only military option was to withdraw. But it was then that the voices of the high command emerged. From his distant headquarters in Berlin, Adolf Hitler issued a categorical order. The 6th Army was forbidden to move. No withdrawal at any cost. This was a suicidal decision. Paulus knew it, and so did General Erich von Manstein, who was advancing in a desperate attempt to break the encirclement. But Hitler had another plan, or rather, he had a promise. Here, the other side of the decision is revealed: the promise. Hitler convinced his commander Hermann Göring, head of the German Air Force, Luftwaffe, to make a bold promise to the trapped soldiers. Göring pledged that his Air Force would establish an air bridge to supply the 6th Army with fuel, food, and ammunition. The only problem? This promise was a lie. The 6th Army needed at least 500 tons of supplies daily to survive. Initially, only a few dozen tons arrived. On good days, 100 tons came, but on most days, nothing arrived. The planes continued to crash due to the bitter cold, Soviet air defenses, and a lack of fuel. The German soldiers, freezing in the cold, waited every day. They watched the sky in the hope of seeing those planes carrying their leader's promise. But what they saw was, in fact, a sign of a betrayal that history would never forgive. After the sky was emptied, the trapped soldiers were left with only one enemy: winter. The freezing temperatures weren't just a number. They were a monster devouring their bodies. Finding any food became a distant dream. Each day was a new fight for survival. Their frozen bread was sometimes used as stones to throw at Soviet soldiers out of sheer desperation. Death began to creep in silently, not just from bullets, but from hunger and cold. With each passing day, morale collapsed. The spark of hope that Hitler had promised them was extinguished. Orders from Berlin told them to resist to the last man. While their bodies could no longer stand, soldiers suffering from gangrene would beg their comrades for a mercy bullet. Even the doctors had nothing to offer but a word of comfort. The battle had turned from a military war into a war for life and for a single piece of bread. Even death was no longer an abstract thing. The psychological terror became stronger than the physical terror. The Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev was not just an ordinary soldier. He became a legend among the German army, planting fear in their hearts. His presence was a constant psychological threat, reminding them every moment that death was watching them from a place they didn't know. These were the moments when the army lost its faith in its leadership, in humanity, and in the purpose of the fight. Their battle had turned from a war for victory into a battle for a dignified death. After months of hell, and after men had turned into ghosts from hunger and disease, the inevitable end came. On January 31st, 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus issued the order he knew would come: surrender. But this surrender wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was the beginning of a new chapter of tragedy. Their numbers were shocking. Over 91,000 German soldiers, once part of the most powerful army in the world, were now prisoners of war, facing an unknown fate. They had been promised salvation, but they found themselves facing death in the harshest conditions. But the story didn't end here. The real story hadn't even begun yet. Of those 90,000 soldiers who surrendered, they held out hope of returning home. But they didn't. Out of all of them, only 5,000 soldiers succeeded in returning to Germany after years of suffering in Soviet labor camps. Where did the rest go? They died from hunger, cold, and neglect in those camps. This was the real price of Adolf Hitler's decision and Hermann Göring's false promises. The story of the Battle of Stalingrad is not just a story of war or defeat. It is a story of arrogance that leads to destruction and of false promises that become death sentences. That battle paid a heavy price, not only with German and Soviet soldiers, but with the very faith in leadership. This is the real secret that many forget. If you want to dive deep into the secrets of history and the most important events that changed the course of the world, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button to receive all our new videos.